I'm sure you've heard of eugenics, and probably the first thing that comes to mind is not the United States, but more its culmination in Nazi Germany. But a lot of people don't know how far advanced the eugenics movement was in the United States itself. That until the 1930s, eugenics was taken further in the United States than any other country in the world. And the other thing I want to just mention is you probably think of eugenics and you often hear the word pseudoscience. And we certainly consider it not a real science now. But I want to stress that at its height, at its time, it was considered real science. It's bad science, but it was certainly considered respectable science at its height. Mainly, I think its height would be the 19-teens, but its policy implications continued much longer. So tonight, just so you know, I'm going to talk about both the science and the policies that came out of eugenics. I'm going to start a little bit with its origins, intellectual origins in Great Britain, talk mainly about the United States, and then briefly talk about what happened to some of these ideas in Nazi Germany in the 1930s. But before talking about all this heavy history, I want to show a quick clip, and it's the credits from a movie that partly gives this talk its name, and there is a connection with eugenics here, even though this movie is of I'd call it the cannibal hillbilly genre or hillbilly cannibal genre. It's a horror movie. I'm not going to show any blood and gore, but there is a eugenics connection. So if we could just see this, it's about 3 minutes, but it's the credits. There's 6 of these movies called Wrong Turn that were made. This was from 2003, and but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about horror movies. I'm not talking about why I'm calling this talk Wrong Turn is, even though there is a eugenics message here, there's a eugenics explanation for this family of murderers in rural West Virginia. The reason I call it Wrong Turn is that I think it's a wrong turn in American history. Thank you. That the eugenics movement, in some ways, and at its height, it was very powerful, and I'll explain how powerful it was among very powerful Americans. It's a wrong turn in the sense that it's a violation of the principles of the Declaration of Independence. The eugenics movement does not say that all people are created equal. It says that they're created unequal, and that those fixed hierarchies of difference are permanent and unchangeable, and you can't educate people that there's a fixedness, a biological fixedness to the place of and turn things like social class into a biological category. It's not just race, but also class, and certainly disability. And I come from this as a historian of disability, so I think a lot of the history, the work done on eugenics is from the point of view of the history of race, but disability is just as important, maybe more so in this. It's a wrong turn in the sense of away from the Declaration of Independence guarantee of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. As you're going to see, the eugenics movement promoted unfreedom and certainly said that made decisions for other people and prevented the pursuit of happiness, certainly. So I'm going to just start a little bit with the science, the scientific roots of this in Great Britain, starting with the guy up at the top right, Thomas Malthus, who was a cleric and an economist. And in 1798, he wrote a little book called An Essay on the Principle of Population, which argued that population grows exponentially, whereas food supply grows arithmetically, meaning population grows 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, whereas food supply grows 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's very pessimistic, isn't it? It means that famine is inevitable. And in some ways, this little pamphlet, which also this guy, Thomas Malthus, said there should not be poor laws. There should not be the provision of food to the poor because you're just creating future suffering. So charity is actually a bad thing in the long run. And it goes against a lot of the Enlightenment ideas of optimism and progress. But this idea that population outgrows food supply means there's going to be a crisis, a crash of population. And in some ways, this is the beginnings of some of the thought that leads to Darwin and his publication in 1859 of The Origin of Species, that there has to be a competition for survival to create the pressures that drive evolution. 1859, Origin of Species, and then in 1871, The Descent of Man puts evolution into the origin of the human species. Now, you might associate Darwin with the phrase survival of the fittest, but actually it's the social Darwinist, Herbert Spencer, who came up with that phrase, survival of the fittest, and his whole life was promoting the idea that society works like a biological species, organism, competition, and that's what drives progress. Now, the idea of social Darwinism is a way of justifying the way things are today, all right? So, for example, very famously, Andrew Carnegie argued that why is he so rich? Because he is the fittest. He is the brightest, he's not the luckiest, he's just the smartest and most capable, and therefore he should be the richest man in the world and choose what goes into our libraries too. But that idea of social Darwinism is that it explains the way things are. And Darwin's own cousin, Francis Galton, was a very smart man. He's a really interesting guy. Social Darwinism is Darwinian evolution is too slow. And this is the beginning of eugenics. Francis Galton was an incredible mathematician. Many of the things that we think of, if you took a statistics course, they came from Galton. He's to blame for you having to do all that statistical stuff. But he came up with the word eugenics in 1883. And it simply means, in Greek, more or less, good birth. What's wrong with good birth? But he's the one who came up with the idea that we should speed up evolution. We should pick who should be, what traits should be promoted and what should be eliminated. And so this intellectual basis starts in Great Britain, but it's in the United States where it takes its deepest roots, not in Great Britain. Who's that? Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt is a eugenicist, but of a particular kind. He promoted positive eugenics in the sense that people of the right stock should have more children. So he said, he really said women of his race and class are not having enough children. And so he really promoted the idea that white Anglo-Saxon women of the middle and upper class should have more children. So that's positive eugenics, the idea that that you promote these traits. But I think when we think of eugenics, we're more inclined to think of negative eugenics. And I'll use the example of this. This is 1915, right at, I think, the peak time of the eugenics movement in the United States. And this is a movie that was created to promote eugenics by a doctor in Chicago who allowed to die a baby who was born with disabilities. He could have saved this baby very simply with a quick operation, and he decided that this baby should die. His name is Harry Hazelton, and he made a movie called The Black Stork promoting that this is the right decision. Not much of the American eugenics movement reached the state of murder, but I just want to throw out this one case. And just to let you know that how mainstream eugenics was in 1915, this created a huge scandal. It was publicized in the papers across the country. All kinds of people chimed in for or against what he had done, and most of it was positive. There were some voices condemning him. But the one voice I want to throw out there is that of, believe it or not, Helen Keller. Now, how do you think Helen Keller would react to Harry Hazleton's decision to kill a baby? I don't know if you know much about Helen Keller. What's your... She wasn't born with her disability. That's scarlet fever, but... That's true. But she's also famous as a long career of humanitarianism and good works. Well, I think she would not have said this later, and she was probably very embarrassed she said this, but this is what she said in 1915. These are the words of Helen Keller. And I took a picture, I could have put it up, I took a picture of the actual letter she wrote on a typewriter. She used a typewriter because of her blindness and deafness. When Dr. H.J. Hazleton permitted the Bollinger baby to die in a Chicago hospital last Wednesday, he performed a service to society and to the hopeless being he spared from a life of misery. No one cares about that pitiful, useless lump of flesh. The hue and cries raised about the quote-unquote murder of this poor, mindless, crippled, half-dead little creature indicates a deep-rooted error in American thinking. Isn't that shocking? And because, and I think she worked very much against the future eugenics activities of the Nazi regime, and she becomes a humanitarian, I think. But just says something about 1915, how mainstream and accepted the eugenics thinking was. And partly that's because around 1915 is the height of eugenics science. Some of the eugenics science increasingly is discredited by the 1920s, and you start seeing eugenics moving into the science of genetics, and geneticists rejecting the conclusions of the geneticists rejecting the whole science of eugenics. But that's in the 1920s. But the 1920s is the high point of eugenics policy. So there's this little lag between the science and then where the policies go in. There's three policies that came out of eugenics science. One, immigration restriction in the 1920s. Two, eugenics sterilization, mandatory sterilization, not by choice, but for eugenics purposes. And the third was laws against interracial marriage, laws which had existed before in the South, but now were justified for eugenics reasons. I'm going to talk about those first two tonight, immigration restriction and sterilization. Here's an example. This, I think, is 1912, but this is from the New York Daily Tribune, 1912. Eugenicists would improve human stock by blotting out blood taints. And these four people are defined as menaces to society. This is mainstream media, mainstream newspaper, menaces to society. And although 19 years old, this girl is 7 years old mentally, and all these people have mental ages less. Where does that come from? Any idea? The idea of mental age? This is a product of IQ tests, and which were created around this time. And so on the left is a high-grade imbecile girl. These are categories based on IQ level, IQ tests. And these terms, idiot, imbecile, moron, which we think of as just terms of derision, had scientific meaning. I mean, it makes no sense because the tests are so bad, but these ideas that people who had low IQ, the feeble-minded, was usually sometimes called mental defective, but let's call the feeble-minded, were also more immoral, right? So this is one of the big assumptions of the eugenics movement. Low intelligence means low self-control. so that you will be more immoral, promiscuous, for example, or given to criminality if you have a low IQ. These ideas of setting everything into a hierarchy, physical, mental, moral, were lockstep. So physically superior, you are mentally superior, and morally superior. I think the most important word in the vocabulary of eugenics is defective. And this is not a famous guy, but this is a guy who wrote an article called The Defective Classes in a journal called Proceedings of the National Conference of Charities and Correction, 1891. This is sort of social workers, but notice it's charities and correction, so it would be prison people, schools, all kinds of almshouses, poorhouses, charities. And in this article coming out of this conference, the defective classes form a series of small but very troublesome tumors upon the body politic. This is a little bit before the eugenics movement really takes off in the United States. But that idea of people, groups of people as being cancers upon the body politic, that's very typical of eugenics rhetoric. Everything is a biological metaphor in this stuff, that this society is a body and that certain individuals or groups of individuals are like tumors, cancers upon the body politic. And he talks about three kinds of defect. Defect of mind leads to feeble-mindedness. Defect of emotions or passions leads to crime. Defect of will leads to poverty. And the most important part of this, and feeds into the eugenics movement, is the assumption that all these defects are inherited. All right? Poverty is like a gene for poverty, a gene for crime, a gene for, it's not just like a gene for a disease, but a gene for these moral and immoral categories. He did say that some people with defects, with disabilities, with sensory disabilities, were educable, that the blind and the deaf could be schooled and they can become useful, but these other defects were fixed and unmovable through education. The eugenics movement science really rested on very, very questionable family studies. The first one, the Jukes, was done by an early sociologist, Richard Dugdale. He looked at a family in upstate New York, and this was done in 1877, and the investigation of these family studies, and there were lots of these, they would find someone in the family tree who was defined just harlot. Harlot is a scientific category in these family studies. Harlot marries drunkard and gives birth to several paupers. And they were just coded. And some of these family studies were just like interviewed, and she was kind of immoral. Oh, she's a harlot. And it just could be just rumor and gossip, and it turns into scientific categories. And these are very silly, but they have really long-term important implications. Now, Dugdale argued that inheritance was Lamarckian. Now, this is kind of complicated. When we think of genetics, we think of Gregor Mendel, and pea plants and all that. And Lamarckian genetics said that acquired characteristics during an organism's life could be passed on. All right? So, it's not a gene for drunkenness. It's the habit of drunkenness is actually passed on, not through experience, but through inheritance. And because he believed in this, he actually said this Jukes family could be lifted up through education. All right? Now, this is bad science in genetics, the idea that characters, but it actually made for better policy. The Jukes were returned to in 1915 by another eugenicist, another researcher, a guy named Arthur Estabrook, who I'm going to talk about a little bit later, He worked with the Cold Springs Harbor Laboratory on Long Island, which was a big center for eugenic research, was funded by very wealthy people, including Andrew Carnegie. But when he came back to the Jukes in 1915, he was seeing these as fixed categories and supported the idea that these people could not be lifted up through education. And the big point he made in the Jukes in 1915 is this one family, because of almshouses, prisons, cost the state of New York $2 million, which then was a serious amount of money. And so preventing that family would save the state of New York a lot of money. A lot of the policies in eugenics were about the assumptions that everything's inherited and that you prevent certain families from reproducing, certain people from reproducing, would save the state a lot of money. That justified first institutionalization, but institutionalization cost a lot of money. So what's the next step? Sterilization, which is cheaper and more permanent. And so institutionalization kept people from reproducing, but it cost too much money. Sterilization was cheaper. And then you have the other, which is a really interesting study, written by the superintendent of the Vineland Training School for children and then adults with intellectual disabilities, the feeble-minded. And he wrote a study called The Kallikak Family, where he traced 2 lines from a Revolutionary War soldier who was married to a upstanding woman, but he also had a dalliance with a tavern wench. And so the Kallikak is Greek for good and bad. And so you have a good line and a bad line, and they would, the bad line created all kinds, you have drunkards, harlots, criminals, paupers, all those things, and all kinds of feeble-minded, mentally defective people. The defects reinforcing one another, whereas the good line was produce productive, good citizens, all right? Now, you might think this is silly, it's just, just from its time. Stephen Jay Gould, in The Mismeasure of Man, this is a book from the 1980s, he did research on Goddard's book, and he found that Goddard doctored the photos of the bad people in his family to, made them look evil, put like big eyebrows. It's so bad. It's like, but it's an early case of photoshopping with an ink pen. But the key thing here is what is assumed to be inherited genetically. It's all these traits of crime, pauper, poverty, laziness. They're all moral traits that are handed down. Now, the eugenics movement is created in this hopefulness that, in a few generations, we can get rid of all these social problems by just selective breeding. And these things like these problems, social problems like crime and poverty, could be just quickly eliminated through who gets to have children. Okay, so that's where. But the key thing is all these things were assumed, and in very simple terms. There is a gene for poverty, for pauperism. There is a gene for criminality. Now, you might think this is just silly and would be rejected pretty quickly, but this is from a psychology textbook from the 1950s, and it's presenting the Kallikak family. And you see, he dallied with a feeble-minded tavern girl, and then he married a worthy Quakeress, and then the descent. This was in a 1950s psychology textbook, and so it's just presented as scientific truth for a long time. What backed up the feeble-mindedness is a very loose term, and to give more scientific validity to the idea of feeble-mindedness was the development of IQ tests. And I don't want to go into too much detail about this. Stephen Jay Gould in The Mismeasure of Man does a great job explaining this whole story. But the Binet IQ tests were started by a Frenchman named Alfred Binet, and his idea was you'd use these tests sort of to find out who needed some special help in school, all right? So it was to provide some early intervention to deal with some learning deficits. It was never intended, he never intended it to be a single number where you could rank everybody and it was, permanent and a permanent ranking of intellectual worth. Other people did that. And Goddard is the one who did this at Vineland School in New Jersey and used it he gave these tests to the people who were confined in his institution. He's also going to bring it to Ellis Island and give it to immigrants. And this is going to have long-term implications. And came up with the whole idea of a mental age. And so I forget the number, like if you are mental age of 3 and under, you're an idiot. If you're from 3 to 8, you're an imbecile. And then he invented a new category from a Greek word meaning silly, the moron, right? And those were the people the eugenics movement saw as the most dangerous, because people with lower IQs were not smart enough to cause trouble. But the moron was smart enough to cause trouble, but not smart enough to have self-control, supposedly. I'm using the language that he would. So they were the most dangerous one and more likely to be carriers of the feeble-minded. They would use the term germplasm. We would use gene. But these IQ tests, here's the one, if you couldn't read and write, this would be, these are what's missing. Now, who is this going to be given to? Robert Yerkes, who was a Harvard psychologist, and joined the Army in World War I, is going to give this to several million World War I recruits. And everyone got these tests. And if you were not literate, you would get these pictures. This is the beta test. And you say, what's missing? And this is just an example. Now, who are they given to? Sharecroppers from the American South. Recent immigrants from Eastern Europe, fresh from the shtetl, or from a peasant from Italy. And what are they asked to say? What's missing from the tennis court? These, and then even the written tests, my students would all be morons, idiots, or imbeciles, because they were all questions like, so-and-so is a stage comedian in vaudeville. Huh? Yes or no? The people they'd never heard of. They just tested familiarity with middle-class American culture. But the conclusions were that most Americans were below average in intelligence, because the IQ is based on, and that the average age of Americans, mental age, is something like 12 or 13. But certain groups had much lower mental ages. Why? Because they weren't familiar with mainstream middle-class American culture. So African Americans from the South, recent immigrants, and these were used to justify a number of laws in the 1920s. Here's a nice picture of an inspection at Ellis Island. And these inspectors would have about 3 seconds to judge a person. And they were looking for diseases, but they were also looking for defects. If someone was a little nervous, it could be, you could get an I for insane or L for lunatic. These were done very quickly. And this was also driven by what Goddard does when he goes to Ellis Island and says that most immigrants from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe are mentally defective. The result of this will be immigration restriction laws. And Goddard himself testified, other eugenicists testified before Congress to do this. But I want to back up a little bit and talk about a guy named Madison Grant. He was a big proponent of of immigration restriction. He did some great things. He was the one who did in some ways saved the American bison. He got the creation of Denali National Park, of Glacier National Park, saved the redwoods. I mean, he did some really great things. And he was also friends with all kinds of powerful people. But I want to not just remember Madison Grant, I want to remember Ota Benga. Madison Grant was one of the people in charge of the Bronx Zoo, and he had a guy named Ota Benga stolen from East Africa. You'd think the slave trade was over, and put on display at the primate house in Bronx Zoo in around 1908. Ota Benga himself tried to get home, and when World War I intervened, he thought he was going to get home, and World War I intervened, and he shot himself in the head and killed himself. I mean, it's just a sad story. But the other thing that I want to say Madison Grant did was write a book called The Passing of the Great Race. And it's a history of Europe as a history of race. And according to him, there are three races in Europe, of Europeans. The Nordics, what is that going to become? And that's going to be the Aryans. The Nordics, the Alpines, who are sort of mid-level, the middle class, the managerial class. The Nordics are the Übermensch, the superior, and then the Mediterraneans, who are the serving class. And because of racial mixing, this is going to lead to the decline of the Nordics, and that's the passing of the Great Race. They will be replaced by these lower, inferior types. This is about Europe, but it's going to be used to argue for immigration restriction, saying that lower types are coming into the United States and diluting the stock that descends from the Puritans. And laws were passed based partly on these ideas. 1917 was a literacy test, but that was aimed at a way of keeping out people from Eastern and Southern Europe. 1921 and 1924 were increasingly restrictive laws of national origin. And the 1924 one basically kept out just about everyone from Eastern and Southern Europe, including a lot of people who will be killed during the Holocaust. Those laws will be on the books until 1965, when immigration will change a long time. But that's a product of the eugenics movement, and prominent eugenicists testified strongly in favor of immigration restriction, and you can read that in congressional report if you want. I'm going to mention this is a weird guy, but I think this brings this a little more closer to home. He's a Harvard meteorologist. You've heard of sea breeze? He's the one who first described a sea breeze, where the ocean, you get a wind coming off the ocean during the day and onto the ocean, and he's sort of a pioneer. Smart guy. But for some reason, he also had to comment on eugenics and immigration, and he's one of the co-founders of the Immigration Restriction League. And there's just an article I came across this article elsewhere, but National Geographic, and it's promoting immigration restriction from eugenics reasons. But I'm not going to talk about this. This is about the second paragraph in this article. It's no argument against practicing eugenics ideas in our selection of immigrants to say that New England country towns are full of hopelessly degenerate native-born Americans, all right? These are the hill towns around here who are inferior mentally, morally, and physically to the peasants of Europe. They're even worse than the peasants of Europe. The degeneracy of our country native stock is probably chiefly due to the drawing off of the stronger and more capable men and women to the cities. So the good stock is going away and it leaves the dross behind. And I just want to say this: eugenics is not just aimed at people of other races. It's also aimed, a lot of the victims of eugenics are native-born white people who are poor, who happen to be poor, okay? And the continued reproduction of feeble-mindedness. The national eugenics for us means the prevention of the breeding of the unfit native, as well as the prevention of immigration and the breeding after admission of an unfit alien. So it's both directed inside and outside this country. And this leads me to the whole issue of feeble-mindedness as the source of all evils. This idea, the hub of our wheel of vice, crime, and pauperism is the feeble-minded kid and all these institutions that society has to pay for. I could talk about this stuff forever. But Walter Fernald is another one of those superintendents of a school for feeble-minded children, this one outside of Boston that's now called the Fernald School. And in the Journal of Psychoaesthetics, 1912, Psychoaesthetics, it's now the Journal of Intellectual Disability. It used to be the Journal of Mental Retardation. You see how this language? Psychoaesthetics just means weak minds, all right? The feeble-minded are a parasitic predatory class, never capable of self-support or managing their own affairs. He's supposedly in charge of a school. The great majority ultimately become public charges. They cause an unutterable sorrow at home and are a menace and danger to the community. And the most dangerous people are feeble-minded women because they are invariably immoral and will pass on their defects. They also become carriers of venereal disease and give birth to children who are as defective as themselves. The feeble-minded woman, I don't know how he knows this, but who marries is twice as prolific as the normal woman, all right? And that leads to one of the most infamous cases in Supreme Court history, and that's of Carrie Buck. Harry Laughlin was a eugenicist, worked at Cold Springs Harbor, testified in favor of immigration restriction, but he also wrote the model sterilization law to get around constitutional problems. There were some hurdles, like the 14th Amendment, but he wrote it that's going to be copied, and it's going to be copied by the Nazis in the 1930s too. And in 1924, his model sterilization law, is passed in Virginia. Carrie Buck is the younger woman there. That's her mother, Emma Buck. And they were both at the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics. It should be for epileptics and feeble-minded. Epilepsy was seen as such a really, really horrible thing and threat to the genetic health of the country. I have Doris there. Her real name is Emma. Doris is her sister, sorry. But that idea of, so both of them were at this institution and called feeble-minded, although the historian who looked into this saw Carrie's report card. She got average grades. In the 1970s, reporters actually went and spoke to her, and they found her and her sister, who was also sterilized for this reason, playing Scrabble and doing crossword puzzles. Doesn't sound that feeble-minded to me. They were poor, okay? And Carrie had a child named Vivian out of wedlock. So that's a sign of her promiscuity, right? Now, the facts of the case that never came out in the trial was that she became pregnant because she was raped by a relative of the foster family she had been placed with. And that was never revealed so much for her innate promiscuity. And Arthur Estabrook, who wrote The Jukes in 1915, he examined this several-month-old girl, Vivian, and said, oh, testified that she's obviously feeble-minded. And I don't know what her mental age was when she was like 7 months old. This historian also looked at her school record. She died of measles when she was around 12, but before that, she got like B's in school and was pretty average, but that's not what the courts decided. This is going to go, it's used as a test case, and it's going to be go up to the Supreme Court. and the Buck v. Bell decision of 1927. I'm not going to talk about this, but think about Carrie and her mother and the group of men at the top. That includes, I think that's Herbert Hoover on the right, but the guy who wrote this decision, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., and I think that is he's now head of the Supreme Court, Taft, and he's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But think of the power dynamics between those guys and Carrie. And I'm going to go kind of quickly on this, but this is the Buck v. Bell decision written by Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., and it states as a fact, Carrie Buck is a feeble-minded white woman. She is the daughter of a feeble-minded woman and the mother of an illegitimate feeble-minded child, just presented as that. It gets worse. She is, and this is based on the sterilization law, the model sterilization. I don't know what this means, the probable potential parent of socially inadequate offspring. I'm the probable potential parent of anyway, it doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, what is socially inadequate? Probable potential parent? She may be sterilized without detriment to her health, and that of society will be promoted by her sterilization. And so the Supreme Court, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., gives this. It gets worse. We have seen more than once that the public welfare may be called upon the best citizens for their lives. What's he thinking about? Well, he's thinking about recently World War I, but he's also thinking about his own experiences in the Civil War. He fought in the Civil War. He went into the Civil War as an abolitionist, a kind of an idealist, and he should have died 3 times. And he saw his comrades, his best friends, killed in kind of stupid ways. But so he's thinking about that. It would be strange if we could not call upon those who already sap the strength of the state for these lesser sacrifices, often not felt by those concerned, in order to prevent our being swamped with incompetence. It is better for all the world if, instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. Okay, the assumptions here, and then he justifies it, and this is kind of relevant, he justifies it on the precedent made by the Supreme Court decision that allowed the mandatory vaccination for smallpox in Massachusetts in 1905. So that's where he draws the equivalent. And then the kicker, he says, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And the book that was written about this was called 3 Generations, No Imbeciles. The fix was in this case in so many ways, and there's more details about how this went down. Now, a lot of the people I've been talking about, I guess, are eugenics of the right, like Madison Grant and maybe Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. But there's also a eugenics of the left. Prominent socialist feminist Charlotte Perkins Gilman wrote a novel, you could read it, called Herland in 1915. And it's this society in the jungle that's uncovered of just women. And how they reproduce is not explained without men, but they reproduce, and they created a society. It started with one noble mother, and they cropped out, they cropped out these defects occasionally, but it's been quite 600 years we've had what you'd call a criminal. We had, of course, made it our first business to breed out, when possible, the lowest types. So it's a feminist eugenic utopia this book is describing. Or Margaret Sanger, in her book, The Pivot of Civilization, used eugenics to legitimize access to birth control. I think here, why she jumped on this is in 1922, eugenics was so legitimate and birth control was so controversial. So she tried, and a lot of eugenists kind of said, no, we're not going to join with Margaret Sanger in birth control. But she does promote eugenics in promoting access to birth control explicitly. And finally, where this ends up going, where the natural culmination of these ideas happens in the 1930s in Nazi Germany, and Nazi ideology as expressed by Hitler's subordinate, Rudolf Hess. National Socialism is nothing but applied biology. American eugenicists wished they could have done what the Nazis did in the 1930s, went there and expressed support for their programs. Adolf Hitler called the passing of the Great Race my Bible. Nazi race laws were modeled explicitly on American laws against anti-racial interracial marriage laws. Hitler in Mein Kampf expressed all kinds of support for both eugenic sterilization in the United States and immigration restriction. And eugenic sterilization will be in a much bigger way. In the United States, about 600,000 people were sterilized for eugenics purposes, all the way up to the 1970s. Buck v. Bell has never been overturned, by the way. It's done much more harshly, including through massive doses of X-rays that killed some people, but they weren't too concerned with that. The T4 program was a program that killed about a couple 100,000 people with various disabilities. It created so much uproar among German civilians that actually Hitler backs away from it, at least in public. There's continuation of secret killing centers of people who were institutionalized, called useless eaters. These partly for the war effort, the killing of people. So, and using poison gas, for example. This is the road to the Holocaust. And American eugenicists gave lots of rhetorical support. I'm not saying that the Holocaust is caused by American eugenicists, but American eugenicists legitimized some of this stuff, gave models for. Harry Laughlin, 1935, one's a model from a Nazi university. So there was lots of crossover here. In the Nuremberg trials, the medical, people involved in the T4 program, including Hitler's personal physician, Karl Brandt, are convicted and executed. But they refused to convict them for the sterilization program. How come? Because then Americans would have been guilty of crimes against humanity. So that's sort of, there's this blind spot in the Nuremberg medical trials. Now, this is all the wrong turn. How about the right turn? Why did the eugenics movement, be delegitimized? Why did support for eugenics decline? And you might think it's all about revulsion at Nazi atrocities. Ultimately, that is going to play a big role. But even before what the Nazis were doing was known, there is a Supreme Court decision that does make unconstitutional mandatory sterilization for criminals. All right? So that, not for feeble-minded people, but for crime. This was a law in Oklahoma that said if you committed 3 crimes, you're 3 strikes and you're out. This was 3 strikes and you were sterilized. And on the basis of the 14th Amendment, equal protection, this will be overturned by the Supreme Court in 1942. So it's being nibbled away. But I think it's the Great Depression. Eugenics explained why people were poor. Who's poor in the Great Depression? Everybody. And all of a sudden, these white middle-class people find themselves poor. And wait a second, I don't have defective germplasm. and so, that I think is a big part of it. Certainly, Nazi atrocities plays a big role in, both delegitimize the eugenics movement and also sort of delegitimizing individual eugenicists like Madison Grant. I have to say this, some of the leading eugenicists are either discredited for Nazi connections, or I find this the kind of just ironic and sort of karma in action. But Arthur Estabrook, there was a big scandal where he found out he was stealing money from the Eugenics Record Office and having affairs with female assistants. He was the one who was promiscuous and immoral. and anyway, or they end up, Harry Laughlin ended his life, had to quit his job with the Eugenics Record Office because he had epilepsy, which is just somehow just, I don't know. So I hope eugenics is a regressive, to use their language, or their idea of inheritance, is a regressive gene in American history and not a dominant one. That it was a wrong turn, it was a mistake, and we won't see it again. I just want to throw this out here. I have some ideas, but local impacts of the eugenics movement? Any ideas? Well, what people could come to New Hampshire, right? A lot of this was aimed at, in the 1920s, French Canadians were the targets of a lot of here and in Vermont. Sorry? And definitely Native Americans were sterilized at higher numbers and growing out of the boarding schools, all that stuff too, but actual sterilization. The Laconia State School was created in 1909 by people who supported the eugenics movement. And then Michelle mentioned the number of people who were sterilized in New Hampshire. Just so you know, California represented about half of all eugenic sterilizations of 30,000. It's very popular there. North Carolina, Virginia were pretty far up there. There was opposition to all this stuff. And in Massachusetts, the Catholic Church prevented eugenic sterilizations from happening. The Catholic Church was very strongly generally, Protestants were, including some ministers, were very supportive of eugenics. So anyway, if the local progressive woman, Jenny Powers, right? I bet she, okay. Now, we celebrate her for good reason, but I bet some of her decisions were made, given the time, through eugenics thinking. And so eugenics represents sort of the dark side of the progressive movement. And we need to represent that. That doesn't mean all progressivism is bad, but there is this dark side to the progressive movement. Eventually, it took a long time, but there was some recognition of the wrongs done. That's a historical marker about Buck v. Bell, explaining what happened to her. There is a movement to stop forced sterilization. And North Carolina went so far to offer reparations, payments, in the 20-teens, I guess it was, the Office of Justice for Sterilization Victims, cash payments to people who were sterilized in their program. And here, I have homework for you. You can take this with a grain of salt, but some books that are about various things I've talked about. The Reform to Equal Rights curriculum has all kinds of things about disability, but there's one about eugenics, including for National History Day, which is in here, about doing research projects in disability history, and one of them is doing a research project for high school students on the eugenics movement in its relationship with disability. And I don't know if anyone's ever seen this, but PBS a few years ago, American Experience had a pretty good documentary called The Eugenics Crusade, which talks about a lot of the things I talked about tonight. So I'm sorry I went kind of long, but any questions here or on Zoom? Yeah.
Sorry to jump in. Obviously, this was a very different time. Oh, thank you. Obviously, this is a very different time from what we live in today, in terms of very defined social classes. It seems like there's a lot more mobility. There's just so many things I don't understand. Like, for example, Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie came from poverty and worked his way up. John Rockefeller was literally selling stuff as a vendor on the streets and worked his way up. So I don't understand how people who rise to that class can then turn their back on where they came from and basically say, oh, well, those people.
Well, I mean, Andrew Carnegie and to a certain degree, Rockefeller, they were just right place, right time.
Yeah.
and were very lucky. That doesn't mean they're also not capable, but that doesn't mean they're the fittest in society. Yeah, and the idea that social class is determined by somehow biological it does seem to counter just common experience. And you're right, some of these people did start from impoverished backgrounds. So how did they break that iron cage of biological determinism, right? So I don't know, people are hypocrites. That's about all.
And that's another thing, talking about alcoholism and things like that. So none of these people knew anybody who was rich who had a drinking problem.
Right.
None of these people knew anybody who was rich who had affairs.
Or stole things. We call them robber barons for a reason, right? Well, anyway, I don't get. It's in retrospect, but it's kind of weird how this grew out of this hopeful idea that you could easily, using science, get rid of all social problems, breed it out of people, so it's in this weird hopefulness. They're trying to make society better, but as we all know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and certainly the case of the eugenics movement, that's true. But some of these people are just jerks, I must say. They're yeah.
The establishment of all the state schools
Yes.
in Massachusetts, the Fernald School, was this born out of the eugenics movement, or?
That's an interesting history, because the Fernald School started by Samuel Gridley Howe before the Civil War. And they were called idiot schools, were founded on the idea that it's more like today, people are educable, people could be trained to be more independent, was one-on-one. But as time went on, these schools all got bigger, more costly, more impersonal, and then the ideas of eugenics fed into it. And they become, so they're started before the eugenics movement, but the eugenicists kind of take over, and these schools become custodial, and the purpose is no longer education, as you could see Fernald there, became about preventing reproduction, a lot of them. It's about isolation and not education.
Did they sterilize?
They not in Massachusetts. So, but there is a case, this is right after the Second World War, where students at the Fernald School were experimented on using radiation to look at this is another kind of Tuskegee Airmen experiment. This is sort of like one of those bad stories in American medicine. By the way, Fernald himself, and this is the other thing that happens to eugenicists, like Goddard and Fernald in the 1920s, they recanted. They said, whoops, never mind, feeble-mindedness is not inherited. So a lot of them, if they don't end up disabled themselves or discredited because of Nazism, they say, whoops, I was wrong. We shouldn't sterilize, and we shouldn't institutionalize permanently people with feeble-mindedness, with various disabilities, mental disabilities. So it's quite a story. It really is. Yeah.
So Michelle mentioned, that we're in a different time, but what comes to my mind is that sometimes, or I've heard cases of where, say, two people with Down syndrome are in love and they are discouraged from getting married. So, and that's not really old news. That's something that still, I think, happens or has happened in recent history.
Yes.
And I think that there's other instances where people with certain disabilities are discouraged from getting married or having children, or, I think it's still happening. And I think the current atmosphere is re-encouraging this kind of division.
Yes.
Of
Yes. I think eugenics science is gone as a science, but eugenics rhetoric as politically powerful is still around. As far as like Down syndrome, people with Down syndrome are going to disappear because individual choices, at least this is not the state saying, but with in vitro testing or in utero testing, that the science of genetics and is creating some pretty threatening things in terms of where this can go. The good news is I think that most of this is done by individual choice and not by government mandates. But the rhetoric of eugenics is definitely, when I first taught my course on the history, I have a course I've taught about 5 times called Race, Disability, and Eugenics. And I was limited to 30 characters, so I couldn't say it's the history of race, eugenics. And now I feel I gotta make that clear. Because there are some signs that some of this, certainly at the level of political rhetoric, that some of these things have come back. And it's kind of scary. Yeah.
How were biracial marriages linked to eugenics?
All right, so in the 1920s, states in the South, which already had that, and then some states in the North said, and the idea was racial mixing would dilute the it's like the racial purity stuff, but it's kind of weird. The weaker race would dominate in inheritance. This is what Madison Grant said in the passing of the Great Race. And so in the racial hierarchy, it would bring down. And so, it's not that there weren't laws against interracial marriage in the 1920s, but they are now backed up with this kind of eugenics thinking. And that's going to be overturned, by the way, in 1960. Those laws were declared unconstitutional in 1967 in the best named case in Supreme Court history, Loving v. Virginia. Yeah. But it was constitutional until 1967. It's not that those laws didn't exist, it's the new justification. I know this is really horrible language, but they talked about mongrelization. And so that's the language of, in terms of race. I didn't
Did
talk
they
much about
consider the black race inferior, and that's why they didn't want this
absolutely.
racial
But
mixing?
absolutely, that was what eugenicists are. They believed in a racial hierarchy very much, and it's people like them who are always at the top, meaning white Anglo-Saxon men of means were always at the top. That's who the eugenicists were. So it gets mixed in with scientific racism and all that, but I also think it's mixed in with hierarchies based on disability. So a race, it had an inferior race was defined as one that had a propensity to more disability, more feeble-mindedness. So disability legitimizes racial inequality. It's these categories get. The more I think about this, these categories of race and disability and class and even gender are very malleable and reinforcing one another.
It's interesting that they didn't sterilize the slaves.
No, you certainly wouldn't want to do that for economic reasons.
There was an economic disincentive to sterilize enslaved people because they had children with anybody.
Yes.
Without, they didn't feel that was weakening the race.
No, in fact, Jefferson thought that it would turn black people into white people. I mean, this is all the weirdness of American history and race, and but that's pre-eugenics, Any questions online?
Any questions in the chat?
There's someone in the chat that they said I could just read this out loud. They want to talk about a story about their father's cousin who was named Fred Boyce, who was put in the Penal School in Massachusetts. And the book State Boys Rebellion is about him and his friends.
Yes.
And their time there. And they were put in a science club where they were fed radioactive oatmeal and all succumbed to cancer.
Yeah. There we go. That was those experiments in I think the late 40s.
Can I ask a question? forgive me for not remembering his name, but the person from Harvard who was the meteorologist.
Yes.
Who inexplicably, yeah, in
Well,
charge of.
he did good science and weather.
Was there any pushback on, hey, you're a weather scientist? What qualifications do you have to talk about this? Was that not really?
I haven't read anything about that. Harvard was a bastion of eugenics.
Yeah.
You know, it really was, and American universities in general. And you would have been, even Keene State had courses that taught eugenics as facts. You know, yes, a normal school, you know, using the language. I mean, you know, you would have learned about the Jukes and the Calicacs and all that stuff. But Harvard, Yale to a certain degree, but especially Harvard was very pro-eugenics. Some very prominent people went there, including the head of the Cold Springs Harbor, Charles Davenport, had been a biologist at Harvard before he went to run that laboratory. Yeah, but I don't get why a meteorologist has the right to be an expert on eugenics and immigration and talk about the hill towns of New England being filled with defectives. Yeah.
I also can't help but notice the intersection of sexism with eugenics in
Yes.
terms of, you know, Carrie Buck and that insane illustration that was in the psychology textbook of the guy who had the affair with the tavern girl. It seems like there was a lot of emphasis on immoral women being promiscuous and reproducing.
And assuming that immoral women were feeble-minded and that feeble-minded women were immoral, you know, that was, that lack of intelligence meant lack of morality.
Were men sterilized?
Yes, but not nearly as
Much higher rate for women.
Yeah. But men were sterilized, and that was where the case in Oklahoma Skinner v. Oklahoma. One of the three crimes this Skinner had committed was, you know, stealing 3 chickens during the Great Depression. Was going to meet, but anyway, yeah, it was 2 or 3 to 1 would be women who were sterilized. And again, the feeble-minded woman was the most dangerous person in America for those years, which is just ludicrous.
But the men who were engaging with them
We're fine. Or, no, I don't know. Arthur Estabrook was.
They were manly.
Anything else online?
I'm not seeing anything
Okay.
else at the moment.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate your being here.